Global migration is one of the most pressing issues on the current political agenda. Already in our days, we are seeing large movements of refugees and migrants worldwide, and it is likely that these will significantly increase in the near future. The four most important reasons for this development are: first, poverty, underdevelopment, lack of economic prospects; second, social conflicts, civil wars and acts of war; thirdly, political discrimination, pressure on minorities or dissenting individuals practiced by authoritarian regimes; and finally, fourth, the disastrous effects of climate change. If we look at this issue from a philosophical perspective, some of the main questions seem to be the following ones. A, which individuals are entitled to move to which place on earth? B, for which period of time are they permitted to stay and under what conditions? C, are states allowed to shut down their borders and to privilege their own citizens? Which philosophical principles should be applied here? D, what rights and obligations do states have towards foreign nationals? E, and what rights and obligations do individuals have towards foreign states? In addition to the urgent problems just mentioned, important questions arise related to the well-known phenomena of ordinary labor migration, the expat phenomenon, and also with the far-reaching legal issues arising from world trade, scientific exchange, or tourism. In our contemporary philosophical discussion, the obvious starting point is that of normative individualism. It will turn out, I think, that maybe Kant does not share this approach, so he does not prioritize normative individualism, and that is the problem which I want to spell out today, the only thing I want to emphasize today. Many of the questions mentioned are undoubtedly typical for the modern age. They characterize our situation today, but even in Kant's time, there was a whole range of reasons for migration. In particular, first, political asylum seeking; second, migration due to poverty; thirdly, the emigration of European religious refugees after the Reformation; and fourth, the colonial settlements of traders and landowners in the so-called newly discovered countries. According to Kantian terminology, all legal questions related to these phenomena fall within the jurisdiction of cosmopolitan right. The jus cosmopoliticum includes all those legal provisions that regulate the relationship between states and foreign citizens. I quote the doctrine of right. This right, since it has to do with the possible union of all nations with a view to certain universal laws for their possible commerce, can be called cosmopolitan right, jus cosmopoliticum, end of quote. What is a little bit problematic here is the word commerce. It should rather be interaction, since it covers more than commercial trades, more than economic perspectives. Now, the impression which one gets from reading Kant's passages on the cosmopolitan right is a somewhat inhomogeneous one. Kant appears to be a theorist located somewhere in between, developing a visionary cosmopolitan perspective on the one hand and restricting all global questions to some narrow forms of trade, but not only trade, exchange on the other. Given that Kant is a deontological universalist, and we expect him to be a normative individualist too, one wonders why he limits the entitlements of individuals arriving at foreign countries to, as he says, a right to hospitality, that what he says in On Perpetual Peace, and he calls that in German Besuchsrecht. He explicitly says that it is not a Gastrecht. Why isn't he more generous to people having urgent reasons or at least legitimate motives to leave their countries? I think that the answer must be this. Kant wants to preserve the independence of individual states and is opposed to what he calls the mixture between the peoples on perpetual peace on this page, which I indicated here, due to his teleological philosophy of history. Separation appears to him as an important precondition for an appropriate historical development of the global interstate situation. By defending that thesis, I want to challenge the interpretation advanced by Caroline Reinhardt in 2019. Caroline assumes that the limited scope of the jus cosmopoliticum on the side should be explained by the fact that Kant's cosmopolitan right corresponds on the side of the obligations to its bearers only to negative duties. But one objection against that is that Kant formulates at least one positive duty, namely that rejecting someone must not lead to his or her annihilation, to the Untergang of this person. To a certain extent, I also think that the aspect of anti-colonialism emphasized by Pauline Kleingeld cannot be the decisive point for Kant's restriction, even if I admit that it plays an important role within the two major texts On Perpetual Peace and in the Doctrine of Right. But let us look very briefly at the details. Kant unambiguously states in On Perpetual Rights that the jus cosmopoliticum should be limited to a universal right to visitation or to visit a country, a restriction that is at least not revised in the corresponding passage 2 years later in the Doctrine of Right. According to Kant, everyone has no more and no less than a right to hospitality towards any foreign territory. This obliges people all over the world to refrain from hostility towards strangers and not to reject them from the outset. However, it prohibits not only the enslavement of new arrivals, but also their permanent settlement unless the host country expressly permits this. My line of argument goes roughly as follows in the more extended paper. First, the innate right to freedom implies that what Kant calls the internally mine and yours, i.e. physical possession, possessio phenomenon, and therefore entitles every human being to occupy a place on earth, as well as moving around between different places. This entitlement is original and cannot be fully removed. Kant explicitly says that originally nobody has more right to be at a certain place on earth than someone else, which is a remarkable statement. Nobody has more of a right to be at a certain place than anyone else. And we would expect him to be an asylum-friendly thinker, but he isn't. He turns out not to be very friendly. Given, on the other hand, secondly, that the possession of external goods must be possible, the externally mine and yours, the intelligible possession or possessio noumenon, we have to accept the establishment of states in which the private use of land allows for the exclusion of other people. Thirdly, nevertheless, within a state, the freedom of movement must be guaranteed. The state is seen as the supreme owner of its territory. So even if there are private owners, there is an ultimate ownership of the state, overriding the private ownership of the individuals. Also, that sounds promising. So it sounds interesting. So the private property is not untouchable, or is not eternal, or something like that. Fourth, states are, according to Kant, coercive legal orders which express the general will of a certain people. Therefore, they protect the rights and interests of their own citizens, although Kant is far from being a liberal nationalist in the sense of, for instance, David Miller, but I call him a teleological nationalist. So what he's defending is a teleological nationalism, which sounds strange, perhaps. Fifth point, individual states divide up the territories on the Earth's surface. They are initially in a lawless relationship with each other's state of nature, which they have to leave behind. Hence, there must be an additional global legal order which relates each human being to each other state. Next point, the perfect supranational legal order would be that of a world state, since only in such a political community normative omnilateralism would be achieved without restriction. But Kant explicitly claims that a full realization of this ideal is out of reach. He maintains that we must be satisfied instead with the second best solution, with a League of Nations, the Foedus Pacificum. Next point, the same applies in the case of cosmopolitan right, which, as we saw, is limited to the very defensive point of exchange, of commercial and visiting exchange. Everywhere in the relevant texts, it is tangible how Kant weakens the normative specifications he makes with regard to historical and sometimes also anthropological circumstances. Now, why does Kant advocate such a defensive model, both of international law and of cosmopolitan right? And I see that mainly the background for that in his philosophy of history. Then I quote several passages. I restrict myself to the on perpetual peace and the doctrine of right, since they are immediately the same horizon of reflection. They mirror the same context. And you see here in the famous passage where he rejects universal monarchy, that he emphasizes the separate existence of a number of neighboring and independent states. Then you have in another quote, which immediately comes after that, but nature wills it otherwise. And then he describes his standpoint of this natural development over time in history. Several other evidences for that. Time is, I think, not sufficient for reading these things out. I come to my conclusion, and my conclusion is the following. Where is that? I see much more material. The summary is that first, Kant's idea of right implies that all people should have a legal relationship with all other people on earth, which is determined by the original right to freedom and the general principle of right. This standpoint clearly is the standpoint of normative individualism. Secondly, ideally, normative individualism would be fulfilled in a form of global juridification. So law should be established between all the members of the human community worldwide, but the individual states fulfill this purpose, as he says, better than a possible world state. Thirdly, behind this restriction lies the expectation that the fulfillment of the normative ideal will be achieved indirectly in the teleological course of history. Fourthly, this explains why Kant is so reluctant with regard to the normative content of cosmopolitan right. Normative individualism is not the complete, necessary and sufficient fundament on which he formulates the jus cosmopoliticum. And finally, 5, 1 might characterize this Kantian standpoint as teleological nationalism in the following sense. Kant is partially subordinating his normative individualism to the unviolated development of states and peoples, and he postpones and posteriorizes the normative interests of individuals to some extent for the development of the nation states. So far, that's what I wanted to say for today.
Okay, thank you for your elaborations. You have presented a convincing answer to the question of why Kant restricts the cosmopolitan right to an international right of visitation, and have highlighted the justificatory function of teleological history. In order to prevent people from foreign countries from committing unlawful land acquisition in other territories, or states from mistreating visitors from other parts of the earth, violating human reason, a legal principle is necessary that helps direct the course of history toward the realization of the highest political good. Accordingly, the restriction to a right of visitation can be explained by the need to avoid unnecessary resource conflicts regarding habitable land and the possible disregard of fundamental human rights of persons without domestic citizenship. Through this, as well as trade and human curiosity, international understanding and cooperation among peoples is enabled in the long term, which can ultimately establish stable local conditions of peace. In this way, the cosmopolitan right, together with its restriction to a right of visitation, is to be understood as a path toward international or intercontinental peace, serving a practical purpose in the cultural evolution of humanity. In my view, this perspective is sufficient to explain the restriction from a practical standpoint and to unite Kant's philosophy of right with his speculative interpretation of history. However, in contrast to this, it also seems possible to me to deduce the restriction of cosmopolitan right to a right of hospitality solely from the fundamental concepts developed in the doctrine of right, and to provide it with an a priori logical deduction. This should be at least possible if Kant succeeds in fulfilling his philosophical promises. I would now like to attempt this deduction briefly. As you have pointed out, the original right of human beings is only one: their natural freedom, which prefigures certain social duties and prohibitions, and in consideration of their physical nature, defines strict boundaries for the normatively acceptable interactions of individuals, groups, and ultimately states. From the right to freedom and the necessity of occupying space on earth follows the right of possession in the form of prima occupatio. Thus, the necessary fundamental concepts of the deduction are, first, the juridical concept of freedom, and second, the material concept of living space. If we imagine any number of rational corporeal beings interacting with one another, the following are entailed: the free scope of individual action, which includes freedom of movement by the right of possession. In those scenarios that constitute applications of cosmopolitan right, the fundamental freedom of visitors are as rational beings conflicts with the property rights of the natives. Let us assume then, all humans have the same fundamental right to free movement and the appropriation of some parts of the land on which they move. Let us further assume that the formation of states is necessary to guarantee the preservation of this right. Then the constellations of legal relationships arise between A, between individual persons, B, between groups of people, and C, between individuals and groups of people. Constellation A is subject to the general doctrine of right, constellation B to international law, constellation C to cosmopolitan law. If an individual arrives in a group of people and both the human right and the property right are to be respected, it is necessary on the part of the visitors that they recognize the land already taken into possession by the group as their property. If they must recognize it as their property, this duty implies the prohibition of renewed possession by the visitor and therefore of settlement. If the visitor enters foreign land by virtue of their right to freedom, a right to settlement is thus a priori excluded. Nonetheless, a restriction of cosmopolitan right, nonetheless, a visitation must necessarily be allowed. From this tension between the a priori fundamental rights, a restriction of cosmopolitan right to the right to be a guest and not a co-inhabitant follows logically as a synthesis. Nonetheless, this may be supportive to global peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your valuable comments. I think we basically agree. What I want to emphasize is that as far as I know, nobody so far spelled out at this point that he is clearly formulating the fundamentals of a normative individualism concerning migration, namely when he repeats the point on perpetual peace that everyone has no more right than anyone else to be at a certain place on earth. And this would then ultimately lead to a liberal practice of migration, labor migration, asylum, religious migration, all of that. But then comes in the limiting condition of of how to apply this normative individualism, and I call this teleological nationalism. So if you look at David Miller and people like him, the liberal nationalists, they emphasize that communities should have the right to protect the project of their own nation state against people coming from outside. And Kant does not share the idea of a nation state. So it's not a nation state he defends, so it's not a project. So the French Revolution, for instance, shaped the project of the French Republic, and we, the French people, want to follow our project of the French Republic. It's not that. So he's not seeing the new developments from the 17th and 18th centuries, namely the Westphalian state order after the 30 Years' War. So Spain, Britain, France being nation states more or less, but he's thinking of states like Prussia or Austria, these states having mixed people as citizens. And still he is believing that these entities are inviolable, untouchable. These should be unviolated, since they are the bearers of the development, of the progressive development, which ultimately leads to the full realization of the talents of humanity. So it is this line of thought which is predominant in him. So for us, it's of course a curiosity. It's a strange sort of thought he develops. And if I would follow your strategy, Corinna and Gareth, I would say one might be able to shape a Kantian approach to migration on the basis of these entitlements coming from the, I think that was your point too, entitlements coming from the innate right to freedom. And that includes free movement, free motion all over the globe. And given that he restricts that only from a teleological, historical perspective, one can leave that aside, I think, and be a Kantian in spelling out rights to migration without that limiting condition.